r/NoSleep. The rules of the old theater. I didn't want the job at first, but you know how it is when bills start piling up. My student loans were already breathing down my neck, and rent was looming like a storm cloud. I needed work, and a listing for a nighttime janitor at the Old Haven Theater seemed easy enough. It wasn't glamorous, but a job's a job, right? Especially when it's the only offer in a town as small and forgotten as this one. The Old Haven Theater wasn't exactly what you'd call inviting. Located smack dab in the heart of a rundown part of town, its old brick facade looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, I convinced myself that it was just an old building with a lot of history. People liked history, didn't they? When I arrived for the interview, I was met by the theater's manager, Mr. Holtz. From the moment I saw him, something felt off. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a gray beard that seemed too well kept for his wrinkled face, and eyes that never quite met mine. They flitted around the room like he was afraid of something I couldn't see. "You're here for the job?" he asked in a gravelly voice, without preamble. I nodded. He looked me up and down, seemingly unimpressed but resigned. "All right, then. Follow me." He led me into his cramped office, tucked away behind a set of heavy, creaking doors. Dust clung to the air, and the smell of mildew hit me like a wave. The desk was cluttered with old papers, ticket stubs, and a phone that looked like it hadn't worked since the 90s. Without so much as a second glance, Mr. Holtz slid a piece of paper across the desk towards me. "These are the rules," he said. "You follow them exactly as they're written. Miss one, and, well, you don't want to find out what happens if you miss one." I chuckled nervously, waiting for him to smile, but his face remained cold, almost somber. "Wait, you're serious?" I asked. He didn't reply, just tapped the paper and stared at me with those darting eyes. His silence chilled me more than the drafty theater ever could. Reluctantly, I picked up the paper. The list was handwritten, the ink smudged in places and the edges worn, as though it had been passed from one person to the next for generations. I scanned the rules. 1. When you enter the building, check all the theater seats. If any are reclined, do not touch them. Wait 5 minutes and they will return to their upright position on their own. 2. The main stage curtains should always be open when you arrive. If they are closed, leave the building immediately and call Mr. Holtz. 3. Clean the bathrooms first. Do not linger. The mirror over the sink will show your reflection, but sometimes it shows something else. If you see something unfamiliar, exit the bathroom without looking back. If your reflection smiles at you, lock the door and leave the lights on. 4. When vacuuming the theater, start from the back row. You may hear faint music. Do not acknowledge it. If it grows louder, turn off the vacuum and leave for 15 minutes. 5. The projector in the upper booth will turn itself on occasionally. You must go upstairs and turn it off within 60 seconds, but do not look at the screen. Whatever is being projected is not meant for human eyes. 6. When cleaning the concession area, you might hear a bell ring, even if no one is around. Check the counter. If you see a bag of popcorn, throw it away immediately. If it reappears, leave the building. 7. You will see a man in a red suit at some point during your shift. He'll be sitting in one of the theater seats. He will not move or speak unless you do. Do not talk to him. Ignore him completely. He will be gone by morning. 8. Leave the building by 3 a.m. sharp. No exceptions. The cleaning can wait until the next day. Is this some kind of joke? I asked. Mr. Holtz's eyes finally met mine, and the intensity of his gaze made my skin crawl. "This is not a joke," he said slowly, enunciating each word like a warning. "Follow the rules, and you'll be fine." I wanted to laugh it off, but the seriousness in his voice stuck with me. Something about the way he said it. Like these rules had been broken before, and someone hadn't come back to tell the tale. But what could I do? I needed the job. So, I folded the list and tucked it into my jacket, trying to shake off the creeping unease as I headed out to start my first shift. The first night. The theater was even more unsettling at night. The lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me as I walked down the main hallway. The air was thick with the stale scent of popcorn and something else, something old, like the musty smell of forgotten places. The first thing I did was check the seats. Thankfully, they were all upright, just like the list said they should be. I stood there for a minute, waiting, half expecting something to happen, but everything stayed still. The bathrooms were next. They were as dingy as I expected, the mirrors clouded with age. I cleaned quickly, scrubbing the sinks and toilets with my back turned to the mirrors as much as possible. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at my reflection now and then, bracing for something unnatural. But it was just me, tired and a little on edge. The strange part came when I started vacuuming the theater. I was only halfway through the back row when I heard it, faint, scratchy music, like something from an old gramophone. The melody was slow and unsettling, and though it was barely audible, it was there. I froze, the vacuum still whirring beneath me, and waited. The music didn't get louder, but it didn't stop either. I remembered the rule, do not acknowledge it. So, I forced myself to keep going. But with each row I vacuumed, the weight of the music pressed on my chest, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. By the time I reached the front row, I was drenched in sweat, and my hands were shaking. Then, the projector clicked on. I'd forgotten about that part of the rules. My stomach dropped as the soft whir of the machine filled the room, sending a shiver up my spine. I dropped the vacuum and bolted up the narrow stairs to the projection booth. My heart pounded in my ears as I fumbled with the switch, but I didn't dare look at the screen. I didn't want to know what was playing. The projector went silent, and I all but ran back down the stairs, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But when I returned to the main theater, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the front row, was the man in the red suit. I hadn't heard him come in. I hadn't seen him move. But there he was, tall and gaunt, sitting with his long legs folded unnaturally in front of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his black eyes seemed to reflect nothing. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He just sat there. The rules flashed in my mind. Don't talk to him. Don't acknowledge him. So, I did the only thing I could. I turned my back on him and walked up the aisle, my legs like jelly, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. I forced myself to walk calmly, even as the air around me seemed to grow colder with every step. When I finally reached the doors, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring straight ahead as though he hadn't noticed me at all. The second night, I almost didn't go back. After that first night, I'd spent the better part of the morning convincing myself that it was all in my head. Just an overactive imagination, I thought. The music, the man in the red suit, it was all just part of the theater's creepy atmosphere. But the money was good, and I couldn't afford to quit. So, with a knot of dread in my stomach, I returned for my second shift. The first thing I noticed was that the seats were all upright again, just like before. But this time, the music started as soon as I walked into the theater. The same eerie, old-fashioned tune, playing softly in the background like it was coming from another world. I cleaned the bathrooms quickly, avoiding the mirrors as much as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My reflection was normal, but every time I caught a glimpse of it, I expected it to move in ways I didn't. As I vacuumed the theater, the music grew louder. I forced myself to ignore it, even as my pulse quickened and the cold sweat trickled down my back. By the time I reached the front row, I could barely hear the vacuum over the music. My hands trembled as I pushed it along the carpet, praying it would stop. And then, like clockwork, the projector clicked on. I sprinted up the stairs again, not even thinking about it this time. My heart pounded as I reached for the switch, and in my rush, I almost glanced at the screen. Almost. But I stopped myself just in time. When I came back down, the man in the red suit was there again. But this time, he wasn't sitting. He was standing in the middle of the aisle, staring directly at me. His eyes, those hollow, black eyes, bored into mine, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. My legs locked in place. My mind raced. The rules had said nothing about him standing. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Slowly, I stepped around him, careful not to make any sudden movements, careful not to look at him any longer than I had to. The air was thick with tension, like I was wading through molasses. As I passed him, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air, and the icy chill sank into my bones, making it impossible to think about anything except getting out of there. I reached the exit, my heart hammering in my chest, and when the door finally closed behind me, I collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath. The final night. By the third night, I had convinced myself that whatever was happening in that theater had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe it was Mr. Holtz messing with me, or maybe there were hidden cameras somewhere, and I was part of some weird social experiment. Either way, I wasn't about to let it scare me off. But when I arrived, I knew something was wrong. The stage curtains were closed. My heart dropped into my stomach. The rules were clear: if the curtains were closed, I was supposed to leave immediately and call Mr. Holtz. But my hand shook as I dialed his number, and the phone just kept ringing. No answer. I stood there, staring at the heavy, velvet curtains, feeling like something was watching me from the shadows. The theater was dead silent, no music, no faint hum from the projector. Even the air felt still, like the building itself was holding its breath. I should have left. I knew I should have. But something about those curtains. It pulled me in. Before I knew it, I was walking toward the stage, my feet moving of their own accord. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body didn't listen. When I reached the curtains, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the thick fabric. I pulled it back slowly, just enough to peek behind it. What I saw wasn't the stage. It was nothing. A vast, yawning void of blackness, stretching out as far as I could see. The air beyond the curtain was frigid, like the kind of cold that steals your breath and freezes your blood. And then, from the depths of that darkness, I heard it. A voice, wet, gurgling, and wrong. Need tasty eyes. I stumbled back, dropping the curtain as my heart pounded against my ribs. The voice echoed in my head, seeping into my thoughts like poison. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. I turned and ran, out the theater, out into the cold night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, and even then, I didn't dare look back. I quit the next morning. I didn't bother collecting my last paycheck, and I never spoke to Mr. Holtz again. I don't know what's inside that theater, or why the rules exist. But I do know one thing: some places have rules for a reason. If you ever find yourself working at the Old Haven Theater, follow them. Follow them exactly. Because if you don't, you may not make it out.